Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back again to the next part in our step series, going through all of the 12 steps, working through the Steps to Freedom workbook. There's a small group of us today watching this live, and so hopefully many others will get to view this later at another time. But wherever you're at today, pray that this message and this kind of help will be supportive to you, and this will help you in the next step of your journey as we proceed together. So today we're talking about step 6. We are going to be halfway done by the time that step 6 is over. So well done if you are on this journey. Keep up the great work. It's really meaningful and it will make a big difference in your life. And so just keep going. Don't get stuck, as I always say. Just keep moving on to the next step and continuing. So I wanted to talk a bit about step 6 today. Again, if this is the first video you're seeing in this series, if you're watching it after the fact, please go back and find step 1 and then follow your way, forward from there. This is step 6 of a 12-step program. Start at the beginning. All these talks are based on the Steps to Freedom workbook, which was written by Doug Weiss. And there's other programs that are out there and that are perfectly good, but this is just the one that I'm kind of going through today. But some of the principles are definitely, they carry over to other books as well. So the goal for today is to give you a snapshot of what this step 6 is all about. And if you want to crack the book while I'm talking, please do that. Do whatever is helpful to you. The whole goal is to demystify these steps and make them approachable for everyone. So use your journal, use the workbook as a journal and just write everything down in it. Any thoughts that God kind of brings to mind, just write those down and then share those later with the person that you are going to report your work to. So step 6 says, we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And there is a Bible verse that I find pairs really nicely with this, and it is, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. James 4, verse 10. So as a reminder, the word we is used instead of I in every one of the 12 steps. This program is meant to be worked in community, and it's very unlikely that we will complete the 12 steps if we do not do this in some kind of a community context. So even if you're not a part of Regroup or not a part of, a workshop with Doug Weiss, find some people around you, somebody that can support you, and you can let them know kind of how your journey is going. And it's going to be much better off for you in the long run. So just as a very small review, in step 4 and then in step 5, we first inventoried and then we shared all of the events in which we have harmed others or we have been harmed. That was what step 4 or 5 was all about. We created a list and then we shared it with somebody else. We have become fully known to God, to ourselves, and to another human being. Those 3 specific groups: God, ourselves, and another human being. And we talked about that in step 5. So please go back and watch that if you want to learn more about that. By doing so, by being fully known to others, the healing power that is available to us when we courageously make ourselves fully known has begun its work. And this will grow with us as we continue through the 12-step process. So healing work has started. Hopefully, if you've been completing steps up until now, you will have felt some relief from doing your step 5, sharing your step 4 inventory. But there's definitely more to come. So don't be put off if there isn't some, magical aha moment that has occurred for you. So now in step 6, we have the opportunity to evaluate what led to the harms that we have caused. An image that comes to my mind that I think really well describes step 6 is we are basically turning over the rocks of our hearts. We're looking underneath them, just like we would outside if we go out in our yards and we pick up a rock and look underneath it. All of a sudden, when we do that, what is revealed to us is a bunch of, an infestation of ugly insects and cockroaches and other things that live under those rocks. They're lurking beneath the surface, but we don't quite know that they're there until light penetrates that area, until we can see what's under them. So the goal of step 6 is to track where this infestation of insects and cockroaches, where they go to. At first they get revealed and they're like, oh no, and they run away into their little holes. So the whole kind of an image or a metaphor for what we're doing here is we're revealing these, what we're going to call character defects, and we're trying to figure out what their source is, and that is the defect that exists within us, so that we can then later deal with those in step 7 and beyond. So step 6 suggests to us that there are reasons why we have done the things that we have done. That's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to uncover what has led to us, having an addiction to pornography, or what has led to us being super critical or judgmental towards others, or what has led to us having no boundaries. These types of things. There's reasons for, the things that we do. And we just talked about all the things that we've done that have hurt others in step 4 and 5. Now we want to know why. Why do we do those things? And so step 6 is a big part of that process. Our souls have been scarred in various ways, and this has led to us developing poor habits and poor ways of functioning. We need to understand what deeper issues motivate our dysfunctional actions and then trace them back to their source so that God can clear out that infestation in step 7. So we're, again, kind of forwarding on to what's going to come up next. So for now, much like we did in step 4, the whole goal here is to list and inventory what these defects are. We're just listing it. We're just putting on paper what these defects, otherwise known as like the root causes of our actions, are. So these are attitudes. They're deep set feelings or ways of thinking that we have within us. And we're trying to notice trends and patterns that need to be changed in order for us to proceed in our recovery. So remember that God is ultimately the only one who has the power to change these attitudes, defects, and behaviors. But we're trying to inventory them and get these things out there. So we're trying to dig a little bit deeper under the surface of, well, I hurt my wife when she caught me, looking at pornography. But like, what was the deeper reason that you were looking at it in the first place? That's kind of what we're trying to get at here. So we seek God's wisdom, or seek God's wisdom as you work this step, and pray and ask him to reveal deeper soul wounds and scars that have led to you getting into your addiction in the first place. These character defects may be deeply tied to the ways in which we actually view ourselves. Through this process, we will come to realize that we are actually not tied to our defects, and with God's power, we can overcome them. There's many things in our lives where we might actually embody these things. Maybe it's a sense of procrastination. Maybe that's a way that we actually describe ourselves to others as, oh, hey, I'm Robby and I procrastinate. What's the reason for that? Like, these are not actually things that we really want to be tied to. And we don't actually have to be, but we on some level, we allow ourselves to be. There's a story that I heard in recovery that is really, I think, a powerful one. And it's the story of an elephant, and how, as a baby, an elephant will, in some kind of a zoo setting, or some kind of a, some kind of a place where they would hold on to an elephant, what they will do is they'll take a chain and they'll tie that chain around a baby elephant's leg, and they will attach that chain to a metal stake that's very strong, and they will, hammer that into the ground, and the baby will try and get away, and they will do that for perhaps days or weeks. They will just continue to fight, and maybe through their youth as well. But eventually, when it comes to an adult, they will just assume that tent peg is stronger than they are, when in reality, their body weight has grown from, say, 100 kilos as a baby up to like 10 tons. And so an elephant will actually stop trying to get themselves away, even if you actually, as an adult, we change that to just like a regular rope and a wooden stake. They will actually not like try and run away, because they will just assume, because they have a memory that, oh, I can't break this. They will actually actualize that, and they won't try and release themselves, because as a baby, they couldn't get away. So in the same way, when we think of ourselves, if there's something that as a child, we couldn't do for ourselves, or some kind of an attitude or a behavior that developed, we might think that we're actually controlled by that, when in actuality, we're actually allowing ourselves to continue to be limited by that, or held back in that way. So that's just kind of a metaphor that I learned early on in recovery that I found super powerful. So just bear that in mind as we think about these character defects. Like, are these things actually things that control us, or are we on some level continuing to allow these things to be there when they're actually not as all-powerful as we might think? Step 6 has also been described as being a step that separates the men from the boys, because it states that we are ready to voluntarily submit to every change that God wants to make in our life. Most of us, if not all of us, would be very willing to have certain character defects go away, but perhaps not all of them. God is very courteous and patient. He is a kind God, and he only actually comes into our souls and our lives in ways that we allow him to do that. In step 3, he didn't impose his will on us. We had to invite him in, and we had to allow him to do his work. And it's the same here in step 6. We need to be entirely ready before God can do his work in our lives. So he's not going to come in and clean up an area unless we are willing to ask him to come in and do that. So again, it takes a lot of courage, and it takes a willingness to be willing to let go of all our character defects. So in order for us to know complete recovery, we have to also be willing to let go of every character defect that we are currently holding on to. This is a key step as we move on forward, because if there's still a lot of character defects within us, we will continue to actually act this way even after the 12 steps are completed. You know, even if we do well in our recovery for 2 or 3 years, if the character defect is still down there, it's like a weed, and the root is still there, and it'll grow up again, and we'll act in the same way. A concept that may seem strange on the surface is that for every character defect that we have, there are actually positive and negative aspects that have led to us continuing to use that. Take critical speech, for example. This is something that I struggle with a lot. Having a sharp tongue, or verbal jousting, as I've called it in the past. There's actually a positive that comes with that. And the positive is that I can feel like I can control others to some extent. If I put them down, or if I act, dismissively to them, or if I try and manipulate them in some way, there's a positive. I'm getting something out of that. But on the flip side, we know that the negative is that we push others away emotionally and relationally when we speak critically to others, right? So with every character defect, there is no character defect that doesn't on some level give us something, right? So if it's lusting for a very temporary short period of time, we're getting an endorphin high because we're seeing something that's attractive to us and we're enjoying that. Of course, the long-term side effect of that is that we can be ungrateful for what we have in terms of the beauty of our own lives, and it can make us compare, people to each other, and ultimately it can destroy marriages, right? So there's many things like that where actually all these defects have a positive aspect to it. Again, not like truly positive, but it does something for us because that's why we continue to do it, right? So we have to evaluate what are those things. And step 6 in this workbook asks us to kind of think about some of that. There's many other examples of this as well, apart from the 2 that I just mentioned. But the crux of it is that there are reasons why we act the way we do, and we need to acknowledge this while we allow God to do his work of removing these defects. As always, just kind of review this thing here. It's imperative to not get stuck. Set aside time to inventory all your character defects and ask God to prepare your heart to be fully willing for him to remove these defects. Again, God does this work. Right now, we're chronicling it, we're inventorying it, we're writing it on paper, and then in step 7, we're going to kind of ask God to remove these things. But for now, we're in the preparatory stage. We're asking God to reveal these to us and then be ready to get rid of it. So 3 main goals of step 6. And again, I've just been saying these, but firstly, to become aware of the character defects that guide our attitudes, behaviors, and actions. Secondly, we want to inventory our character defects. And then thirdly, we want to ask God to prepare us to be ready to fully let these defects go. So it's actually not something that we can just be like, oh yeah, I'm done with that, let's get rid of it. Or maybe there are some that are like that, but there's some that will actually be deep-seated, and we actually need to ask God to kind of like till the soil of our hearts and let it loosen up a little bit so that we're willing to let that go. So some specific guidance for you as you go through the actual workbook. I would say that the Steps to Freedom workbook actually does a really good job of this step. I've used other materials from other authors, and I think that this is perhaps the strongest. Step 6 and 7, I think, are one of the strongest thing that this book does well. I actually got a lot out of my most recent time going through the steps with this workbook because of the way that it kind of lays it out. So just a couple examples, things to bear in mind. On page 64, again, of the Steps to Freedom workbook that we're working on, it talks about listing the defects that you have, that you've seen in your past, and it gives you these like age ranges to put them in. If that works for you, great, write them down. For me, I'll just read what my kind of ages 1 to 10 were. Again, my whole thing that I wanted to say here is that if the chronological thing works for you, great. But if it doesn't, just treat this as a big list and just write down any character defect. Doesn't matter when you first noticed it appearing in your life. That's not really the goal here. Just get it down on paper what those character defects are. So For instance, for me, from ages 1 to 10, I wrote 5 defects that came to mind. One was giving up easily. The second was that I was acting weak or cowardly. The third was that I was lustful. The fourth was that I was envious of others. And the fifth was that I was rebellious. So those were 5 things that I can kind of, I don't actually have a great memory of what I was like from ages 1 to 10, but if I think back on how I may have acted as a child, those are 5 things that kind of come to my mind that I would have, kind of lived out a little bit, and maybe some of the source of when those things started to appear in my life. But again, don't get hung up on when it appeared. Just write the character defects down. That's the main goal. So yeah. On page 67, there is a really good, I think the main heart of this step, I think, is on page 67, which is to write down all of the character defects. Again, you can basically just take your previous list on page 64, look at all those defects, and just transplant them over here. The main goal of this part is to look at the percentage column. On the chart, it says, what's your defect? What's the length of time that you might have suffered from that or been living out of that? And the third column is, what percentage are you willing to let go of that? And I think that's a really good exercise to kind of think through, because when I did this, again, about a year ago, I was working on this step. I wrote down, honestly, the first defect I wrote down was being prideful. And I wrote, I'm 80% willing to let go of that. Because honestly, there's still parts of that I'm still struggling with on a daily basis. And there's actually a part of me that I get something from being prideful, because I get this self-image where I know best, right? So if I'm honest with myself, and that's what we're doing here in these 12 steps, we're being honest. I'm actually not, at that moment when I wrote that down, I wasn't 100% wanting God to remove that from me. So again, this is a process. This step 6 is to ask God to make us ready to do step 7, to let these things go. But go through every defect, write them all down. The length of time is, again, not so important in my mind. The important part is the percentage. So be honest. There were things, another defect I wrote down was resentment. And I wrote that I'm 100% ready for God to take that away. I don't want to live a life of resentment. It's not doing anything good for me at this point in life. In a selfish way or in a, towards others kind of way. So again, write down, use your list you created on page 64, transplant it over here. And the whole goal is to write down what actual percentage are you honestly wanting God to remove that from you. And be honest, if there's something on there that you're like 0%, I'm actually like holding on to this character defect because it actually is doing something for me. It'd be better for you to write that down and be honest, and then ask God prayerfully to change that in your head than to write down here every character defect and just write 100%. Like if that's what you feel, great, that's good. But I would ask you to go deeper. Think about, honestly, do I want to 100% have God take away my habit of time wasting? I wrote 75% because I actually still kind of like wasting time. I enjoy it, right? So when I'm supposed to be working or whatever like that. So just be honest with yourself and write down all those defects and how willing you are to let them go. And then finally, last piece of advice for this particular step, page 68, next page over. It talks about closer to the bottom of the page, there's a paragraph that reads, write the character defects that you are 100% ready for God to remove. So my suggestion here is just to write down the ones that are for sure 100% from that previous page, and then pray over those, asking God to remove those fully, and to, again, just make the soil of your heart soft to remove those other ones that you're actually not willing fully to let go of yet. Ask him to kind of be working on you in that area. Also in I guess the question at the very top, it asks you to write about each character defect on a separate piece of paper, write a paragraph about each one. I didn't honestly do that. I actually ended up taking all my defects and I characterized them into 3 subtypes. I found there was a number of them that were based on my attitude, a number that are based on my conduct, and a bunch that were based on my current addiction. And so I basically wrote out 3 paragraphs and I kind of clumped those together, all the ones that fit under my attitudes, all the ones that fit under my conduct and my addictions. Whatever it is, the whole purpose is for you to ask God to remove these things, or to make you ready to remove these things. So whatever that takes, just do that for you. But again, don't get hung up on the exact format and doing everything to the letter of the law as the book describes it. So there's a bigger purpose behind all this. So that's the main meat and potatoes of what, step 6 is all about. Again, I would encourage you to be sharing all this work as you go through it. Find somebody you trust who will, receive the highlights, meet with them, go for a coffee, talk about, wow, this step, these 3 questions really jumped out to me, and just read what you wrote to those 3 questions, or 5 or 6 or whatever it is. But do this together if at all possible. Like we've talked about before, step 5 and 9 are really key to do with another person, but I argue every step is important to share with another person. Again, if we believe, like James says, that we actually gain healing from sharing our sins and confessing to other people, the more we confess, the more healing we're going to get. So be brave, find that person, whoever they are, and just work your way through this step with them. Set aside time to do this every week in terms of doing the step work, and just be honest. Don't sugarcoat anything. Don't write down what you think your wife wants you to write on that page, or don't write down what you think Dave Currie or whoever, Doug Weiss wants you to write down. Write down what you actually believe. It's not about those other people. It's about you and your future. So yeah. So yeah, that is about it. Again, keep going. Don't get stuck. Don't stop. Keep moving. Set a time. Write out these lists. And then move on after the time limit that you've kind of set for yourself of a month or whatever it is that you're kind of working your way through each step on. But yeah, don't get stuck. Don't let this kind of the pressure of writing down a perfect list stop you from moving on. There will be other opportunities. I've talked about it before, but in terms of recovery, I treat the 12 steps as a treatment for cancer. You do it when the cancer comes back, and you do it again if the addiction comes back. And so if there's something else that comes to mind, you can do that again in a future list, or you can just do it as a part of your step 10, which is kind of ongoing, making amends to others. There's nothing to say you can't. Something that God brings to your mind 6 months after doing this step, it's still a character defect, and you can still talk to God about it and still ask him to do this kind of work on it. But just write down everything that comes to your mind, and then say, okay, God, this is everything in my mind, and pray over it and ask him, is there anything last things? And if nothing comes to mind, move on to the next step. So that's my advice on how to keep moving, because the worst thing is to stop in the middle of a step and then never finish the life-changing work that can come. So I will end that there. So all the best to you as you complete step 6. And I look forward to chatting in the future regarding future ones. So take care.